So last week we talked about how the ELCA has social statements on significant social issues that include a lot of scholarship and thoughtfulness from pastors and lay people that go through a long process of creation and then review and comment. We also talked about the fact that there's also social messages that are not quite at the same level as the social statements. The social statements are put out as policy by the ELCA. The social messages tend to be our perspectives on different issues that face us as a church. And I will be putting together some sort of something to introduce people to social statements and social messages. But what we said last week was that then this week we would take a brief look at two of the social messages that were put out by the ELCA. Those two are called The Body of Christ and Mental Illness, and the social message on suicide prevention. And I am so thankful that we are doing this because I know I've read these before, but when I read them again, they are just so good. So the suicide prevention one was put out actually in 1999, and then it was updated in 2021 to have more current resource and statistics information in it. The one on mental illness was adopted by the Church Council of the ELCA in 2012, at the end of 2012. So both of these statements are wonderful. So let's start with the body of Christ and mental illness. What I wanted to do was to share, it starts with some statistics. It says in their lifetimes, 1/2 of Americans will have a serious mental health condition, but fewer than half of them will receive treatment. So in their lifetime, 1/2 of Americans will have a serious mental health condition, but fewer than half of them will receive treatment. And the other thing that I thought was shocking, a study by the ELCA, this was in 2012, found that 16% of male clergy and 24% of female clergy to be suffering from depression. So these statistics, and then I'm going to share my screen. There's an organization called the National Association for Mental Illness. I think that's what it's called. NAMI, N-A-M-I, that offers all kinds of resources around mental illness. But these are fairly current statistics that 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness any given year. 1 in 20 US adults experiences serious mental illness in any given year. And 17% of our youth experience a mental health disorder. And so then it talks about the different kinds, that anxiety and depression are kind of the top two. Then it gives a sort of a breakdown of people by different groupings. So it's not just race or color, but also, as you see, 50% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults have experienced mental illness in any given year. 50%. And then they have all these other things about how you can get help. Now, I think, Lassa, can you see, did we change to a website?
I still see the picture you have.
So let me stop, and then I'm going to reshare.
Okay. I saw the statistic.
Yeah. So here is it's the National Alliance on Mental Illness. And so they have, all of these facts, and look at this, 22.8% of US adults experienced mental illness in 2021, 57.8 million people.
That was in the middle of COVID, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. And so
okay.
Yes. And so they go on to talk about somewhere. I spent a lot of time in this, in this website. They go on to talk about that that with COVID, it's gotten more
Worse.
prevalent
Okay.
because COVID was such a traumatic event for everyone.
That and it. Isolation.
Yes,
Mm.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. I mean, the whole experience of COVID, of not being able to be with friends and family and all of this.
I'm concerned about the word depression.
Okay,
Are we talking, and I don't know the difference.
Yeah.
But I know of depression and I know of what's called clinical depression. Are they two different things?
so I'm pretty confident that what they're talking about is clinical depression.
Okay.
Okay.
Which is different. So I am not,
Yeah.
I am not a practitioner of mental health. But it is possible to have depression around a particular event.
I was gonna say, I think that's normal. That's
Yes.
a part of life.
Correct. So what they're talking about is clinical.
Okay. Where you can't do anything, you can't get out of bed, you can't
Yeah.
think straight. You
Yeah.
can't. Yeah. Okay.
And so they even have, they have, mental illness, warning signs and symptoms, the different mental health conditions, things that are common with mental illness, treatments, the health by the numbers, that was the thing that we looked at, other research, but they offer assistance. So anyway, I just thought that this was a good place to kind of start. That if you want to have more information, NAMI is a wonderful resource. So, I could bring up this piece of paper, but I don't think this will be too terribly helpful. If it's okay with you, Lassa, I'll kind of walk through what's in this social message, and then if you guys want paper copies, we can make copies, or one of you can have this one. And Lassa, I can send you links or downloads of these two documents. So the ELCA put out this message because this is an important thing that affects the people in our church and the people in our world. And it talks about one of the biggest issues is that people with mental illness experience loneliness and isolation, and that those experiences are deepened by society's lack of understanding and stigma, right? That there's still, and I think you've said this over and over again, Lassa, about the stigma around mental illness and suicide, that there's a tremendous amount of shame instead of having openness and treating mental illness like we would a physical illness, right? There's all of this concern. The loneliness, shame, and society's lack of understanding. And not only that, but in the ELCA, in the social message, it talks about a lack of treatment for mental illness, that even people who have insurance that covers mental illness, there aren't enough providers and facilities to meet the need.
And many won't go anyway.
And many
even
won't
if it's
go.
covered.
Yep, many won't go, and those who do go, it's not enough.
A friend of mine.
I think that's one of the big issue here is that if we take someone to treatment, we can't get in. It may be 6 to 12 months waiting time. And that's not only in the United States, that's also in Europe, is everywhere. And the combination here is so damaging. Some people will not talk about it. If they talk about it, they can't get the help they need. So it is a very bad circle. And I just want to bring in one thing. I don't know if you had that on a statistic, but boys and men are higher risk than female.
Yes, and higher risk for suicide.
Yeah. I'm not talking about health issues because, sorry, I was jumping to suicide. But for suicide, even active sports people, out of 10 suicide, 9 is boys and 1 is girl.
Yep. And Lassa, Marianne was sharing something.
A friend of mine who's in the Point of Rocks women's club community. Her husband passed and she went into clinical depression and they tried to get her help. And the first available appointment was close to 10 months out.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she
It
spent,
is so bad. It's so bad. We don't have enough
Right.
people to help. They are overwhelmed, everyone.
Yes. Well, and so the ELCA says this social message hopes to proclaim the gospel's powerful news and offer up the body of Christ, sign of healing and hope. It also intends to raise awareness in the church that mental illness, which is so often hidden away, is present in congregations and communities and is a major public health issue.
I have actually 3 nieces in the same situation, but one niece in particular who is bipolar and is now married. She's in her late 30s. And her husband says there's absolutely nothing wrong with her, and she just needs to pray more.
Well, and that's part of the issue too. There have been churches who have said, if only you had Jesus, you would not have mental illness. If only you believed harder, if only you prayed more. But that, and I think that's one of the driving forces behind the social message as well. To be clear, that is not where we stand as a church, that God has gifted us with medicine.
It's also somewhat cultural.
That's very true.
Her husband is Hispanic and his background.
Yeah, it is cultural. And there are certain cultures that have been mistreated at the hands of the treatment. And so they tend to not even try to address treatment. Yeah. One of the things I thought was really fascinating was that it says that residents of rural areas have even more challenges than other places. The 3 principal problems of rural mental health care can be described as access, availability, and acceptability. So we talked already about, is it acceptable for me to go get treatment, or will all my neighbors say, well, we've always known that?
It's also, Deacon, that if you live in a city, it's easier to hide and not be seen.
Yeah.
If you go to a rural area, everyone knows everything about everyone.
Well, there's also a difference in age acceptance here. One of the questions is, are we identifying it today when we used to? So there seems to be more of it today, which I doubt. It's simply that we now have given a label to it.
Yeah.
I am positive that of my father's 18 brothers and sisters, at least 3 of them were bipolar. No one identified it or would have accepted if they had.
Yeah. I mean, my family, my entire family, and I bet most of my father's family suffers from anxiety, like terrible, terrible anxiety. And none of them ever got treatment because that's not what we do. That's right. So it also goes on to talk about how veterans experience difficulty in obtaining treatment, that the VA can't keep up with the demand for mental illness support for veterans. So I thought that was sad, very sad. And that then on top of not being able to get treatment, there are other challenges that people with mental illness face in their everyday lives, like their social networks and their family relationships are under much more stress, right? I have a friend who is bipolar and has OCD, and her husband left her because he couldn't live with all of the stress anymore.
And I can't blame them for that either, but
yeah, right.
It's hard.
Right. Finding and keeping employment is difficult, right? Symptoms might be misunderstood and misinterpreted. Law enforcement doesn't always know how to deal with mental illness. So, there's all of these like piling on factors with mental illness.
oh, wasn't it just recently, within the last 18 months, that the police and fire department can seek mental illness without being it on their record?
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
Yeah.
I don't mean to use the word crazy, but I think it's
Yes.
ridiculous
Yes.
that the people who are under so much stress, if they get assistance for any kind of mental illness, that it goes on their record and is held against them.
Mhm.
And the flip side of that is, don't we need to know that these people are under stress and have terrible anxiety if they're going to be in charge of weapons?
Yeah.
Or, I mean,
Like, should we
there's
be
two
helping
ways
them
of
as
looking
a
at
matter
this.
of course?
Yeah,
Yeah,
but a lot of them didn't seek help because they knew it would be on
Right,
their
they'd lose their
permanent
job.
records.
Right.
And it would affect their,
sure.
Their
pensions.
pensions and their pensions
Yeah.
and their
But now they
Yeah.
can seek the help and request,
confidentiality.
no,
Oh.
like a death duty or
Huh?
something. So
So
that,
that makes sense. I
so
don't
that
want them
they-
out in the street with the
Yeah.
guns.
yeah, so they don't turn in their badge, but they turn in their weapons
Yeah.
and do
Yeah.
other stuff.
Okay,
on
I'll
it.
accept that one.
Yeah,
Yeah. So then in this social message, it talks about what people with mental illness need. So of course, they need access to high quality, well integrated professional trained care. But also, they need to have relationships and community who can share the responsibility of relationship, right? So it's not just all on one person. And so it says, paradoxically, those who are living with mental illness have a great need for sustaining relationships and have a very hard time maintaining them. And just a reminder that that people with mental illness also need dignity, that the presence of mental illness doesn't mean that a person has lost their intellect, their talents, or their usefulness, which I think a lot of times, right, they're with this isolation, there's this, oh, well.
My youngest sister has 3 adult children. The 2 girls, the 2 older ones are both bipolar.
Mhm.
The oldest one had a perfect 1600 score on her SAT. The second one refused to take it. And we know that she's at least as bright as her sister. And the boy, the youngest one, is clinically depressed. If I had been my sister, I probably would have slit my wrists and been one of the suicides by now.
Yeah, because it's a lot.
That's a lot. And their father, her husband's father, committed suicide. So you've got all of this.
Yeah.
This family is a mess.
Yeah.
They're doing their best, and my sister is, I don't know how she survives it.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the other things that this talks about, that even when people with mental illness get medication, it takes time to get the right balance, and that there's as much sort of art as science to just see, what works for a particular individual.
And some counselors have the right message and some
Yeah.
don't, and then you have to seek a counselor that
Right.
is helpful.
Yeah. Yep.
And if you're a female, a lot of the drugs that they give you cause you to gain weight, and then you refuse to take them because now you weigh 250 pounds and you
don't.
were
Right,
like
you have a whole
Sprite when
different-
you were 18.
And you have a whole different issue.
Oh, yeah. It's
Yeah.
a mess.
And so in conclusion, that this statement says, what does this church say? So what our church says, right, is that healing is more than just cure, because most mental illnesses cannot be cured. They can be managed, best case scenario, but they're not cured. And that healing is a bigger thing than just curing a particular illness. That the church can be a locus for proclaiming the good news of healing of body and relationships, not just to people living with mental illness, but from people living with mental illness. Meaning people living with mental illness should have a voice too, that they are called into community just like everybody else. And one of the most important correctives this church teaches is that the presence of mental illness does not indicate particular sinfulness in the person who is affected, that this is not a result of sin.
Let's
And I
go back
think-
to the Middle Ages and
I
string
know.
them up.
they're all Jewish.
How
Yes.
sad is that? And that they are God's beloved, and that their caregivers need care also. That this is not just, right?
That's the only part I can deal with,
Yeah.
to help my sister when I
Like you're
can.
saying, yeah. Yeah, being the caregiver can be so stressful because you can't really control anything. And so then what does the church do? By being the body of Christ. As Christ was not afraid to be vulnerable or to show his wounds, the church, when living faithfully as the body of Christ, is not afraid to be vulnerable and wounded. The willingness to be present as vulnerable is a gift and is itself a form of service. Imagine that, a place where we all are more willing to share. Right? Because all of us are carrying something around. And if 50% of US adults experience mental illness in their lifetime, it's half of the people that we encounter, right? So, so that the church is really called to speak into this about, you know, more treatment options, and for us to be open to each other. That mental illness is not something that you're going to pray away, but rather something that that we're here to support each other through. And I know it's 9:30, but the suicide prevention. Well,
Deacon,
yeah.
I don't know if you are aware of it, but we used to have a pastor who killed himself. You know that? Yeah. And I think that come as a shock to everyone. And he was a man.
Yeah.
Statistically, that goes that way. But yeah. So
Yeah.
we have some experience, and one thing we did wrong at that time, to my opinion, was that we did not follow up with some kind of conversation in the congregation when that happened. We should have done that, because that's one of the most important thing I see in mental health, is that if someone suffer, they need to get help immediately.
Yes.
Immediately. And
Yes.
in today's society, that's not possible. But if we have a big accident, like a train accident or a bridge falling down, then the local community is very good in setting up a team.
Yeah.
Why can't we do that more often when we have the small accidents as well?
Yeah.
You gave a statistic at the very beginning about, what was it? I'm probably have the numbers wrong. Certain percentage of pastors or
Oh, yeah.
ministerial. What was that?
Yeah,
one
way
again?
back in 2012, 16% of male clergy and 24% of female clergy were suffering from depression. My guess is that it probably was more than that, that, you know, that clergy are not exactly encouraged to self-report either.
And I guess part of my question then becomes, is it part of the job description that depresses you because of what you're dealing with? Or do people who are, how do I put this, feeling
sensitive,
deeply
yeah.
attracted to the profession?
So I think it's a variety of things. Again, this is not based on any research, but on my experience. I think when we look at the statistics overall, those kind of fit, right? Because it says 20% of the population.
Yeah.
And so 16
why
and
would you be
24 is, so that probably, you know, fits that as well. But I think also being a pastor can also be very isolating. So think about all of these people who are a sole pastor in a congregation, and so many of them think that the weight of the world is on their shoulders. And from my experience, there's not a whole lot of support network for clergy reaching out their hand and saying, if you need help, I am here. Now, I have not experienced that because, for example, when Bart died, 3 of my clergy colleagues in this area reached out to me and said, if you need to talk, I'm here. So that is such a beautiful thing. But back when I was first starting in ministry, I was at an education event for new pastors and new deacons. And they were talking about the support for mental health. And one of the assistants to the bishop from another synod said, yeah, but if you do that, it goes on your record, and bishops will look at that and think that they don't really want you.
Here we go again.
He said, what? You've got to be kidding me. You would rather have people not getting treatment? So So, you know,
Same
I
difference.
think that's part of it. And I think there are people who are in the ministry who do feel really deeply and who haven't been raised with a lot of tools to deal with those feelings. And so, you know, then all of that together creates quite a sort of tempest in a teapot, right? Like, where do you go if you haven't learned that it's okay to get help?
And I think that's part of our problem with younger children, with so many teenagers and children now who are depressed because they haven't yet been taught to handle difficulties. Somebody always jumps in and handles it for them. So as they grow up, they have no tools to handle their own issue.
Right. Yeah. Well, and they have access through social media to the best days of everyone else's life.
Right.
And so when you're comparing your worst day to someone else's best day, it's always going to seem like you have such a
But
terrible
Deacon,
life.
I think you touched something very, very important. Mental health is equal weakness. And that's not only for pastors, that is in the business as well. If you indicate that you have some kind of mental health
Yeah.
issues, you are on a watch list for being weak.
Yeah, unlike
That's why many people hide it and they will not talk about it because they know that the system around them is not educated to treat it.
it's true. Yep. So I'm going to leave us with the suicide prevention message, which really talks about. In the introduction, it says Christians believe that life is God's good and precious gift to us. Yet life for some human beings sometimes appears to be hell, a torment without hope. And so I think that really speaks to, you know, part of the suicide issue. It also talks about people living in a household with a firearm are almost 5 times more likely to die by suicide than those in gun-free homes. And the thing that I want everyone to know is that if someone that you know indicates to you that they're considering suicide, there is this myth that if you talk to them about it, it will encourage them to go ahead with it. But the truth is that people considering suicide often have tunnel vision, and in their moment of unbearable pain, the suicide act itself is impulsive. And so if you talk to someone and ask them, are you considering suicide? Do you have a plan? Do you have the method to do it? It is actually helpful to them because it might release some of the stress. And if they have a plan and if they have a method, it is highly likely that they will go forward with it. So you can offer to either go with them to a mental health thing, to call 988 with them, to do something to get them through that moment. So I think so many people think if you talk to someone who's considering suicide about suicide, that will push them to it. And that is not at all the case. I have personal experience with this, that someone came to my church, my old church, and was considering suicide. And we had this conversation. They had a plan. They did not have the method, but they had a plan and we got them help. So please know that the right thing to do is to ask and to talk. And that we as a church can help by again, reducing the stigma, that there is not shame in this, that people get to that place sometimes and we can be here for them. And yet sometimes there's nothing we can do. So thank you guys. So Judaism, Islam, and Christianity are all Abrahamic. I don't know if that's how you say it.
I
Faiths.
never thought about Islamic thing.
Yeah,
But yeah,
it's
yeah.
based. And so we'll talk about what they all share.
Okay.